Welcome to Most Popular, the podcast that explores the impact pop culture has had on society. I'm Dr. Trier-Bieniek, a professor of sociology, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Dr. Bruce Drushel. Bruce is a professor and chair of the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Miami University. His teaching and research interests are in the areas of media policy and economics, audiences, media history, and LGBTQ representation in media and film. He is founding co-editor of the journal Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, and he has edited or co-edited 5 books, including LGBTQ Culture, The Changing Landscape, and a book called Star Trek Fan Phenomenon, which we talk about a little bit. Bruce and I met when I thought many moons ago that I would do an edited book on the ways podcasting has helped people with marginalized voices have a space to express themselves. Bruce submitted a chapter that was easily one of the best things I have ever read, and that's saying a lot considering the rock stars I've worked with. The book fell through, and after I sent the email saying the contract had been canceled, Bruce emailed back and said that I should use the opportunity to put together a collection for a journal instead. Now, at this moment, I was deep into my sadness PJs. Hot chocolate in hand, Sarah McLachlan playing in the background. You know the scene in the first Sex and the City movie where Carrie gets to the Mexican hotel and she's like, close the shades, all of them. That's how sorry I was feeling for myself when I got his message. He helped turn that project around, and I am so grateful. In our conversation, we talk a little bit about the history of queer voices in radio. We talk about how podcasts have become a space for people in the LGBTQ community to share their experiences. And we also talk about some of our favorite old Hollywood stars. I loved this discussion, and I hope you enjoy it too. Here's my conversation with Dr. Bruce Drushel.
I'm Bruce Drushel, and the thing that currently consumes most of my time is I'm a chair and professor in media journalism and film at Miami University, which is in Ohio, about halfway between Dayton and Cincinnati. And as part of that, I have interests in certainly LGBTQ representation in various media. That has been kind of a late specialty of mine. When I was hired here some 37 years ago, I taught broadcast journalism because that's my professional background. I'm a journalist. And I also taught media management and economics and media policy. Over time, I've also added to that portfolio things like media history. Lately, I've also become interested in film generally, film history generally. And so I teach an introductory film class here. And I'm working right now on a science fiction film course. Before I got into academia, I was a journalist. I worked in radio. And so in part, that's a lot of my interest in radio. I grew up listening to radio back when I think radio was really, really good. Commercial radio was really, really good. Now, these days, I tend to listen mostly, I think, to public radio. But I still kind of, I guess, am fixated on the radio, on the way radio used to be, and on the role that it used to play in people's lives. People tend to forget that these days that in a lot of cases, one's tastes were formed to a large degree by what they listened to, and they began to, as most people do in adolescence, you kind of break away from your parents in terms of the way you like to spend your time, what you like to do, and radio was a big part of that, and especially starting in the 1950s when people could begin listening to a degree to things that they felt really spoke to them. And not to their entire families. I think radio began to play a special role in that process of becoming a unique person and becoming an adult.
It's funny that in the same kind of thought process, you made the leap from AI back to radio, because I think I've had this discussion with a few folks. I think that what we're experiencing now with AI and kind of the high alert that people started to get on is very similar to when it transitioned from radio to television, and everyone, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're not going to have radio anymore. And kind of the same with like penmanship to typewriters, or, spell check on the computer from typewriter to Word or whatever you use. It's just so funny that it's cyclical, right? Like that kind of I don't want to say moral panic because that's not the word, but kind of this alert that society tends to go on when these things change is a very similar reaction, even, depending on what we're talking about.
Well, maybe we can coin a term, something like tech panic or something like that.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you. People have been ready to consign playing of music, on musical instruments to the graveyard once radio came along. And radio also was going to spell the end of the film industry, and
Right,
television
right.
was going to kill both of them, supposedly. And then when the internet came along, that was going to kill television. And
Mhm.
in reality, all of these media are still around. And it's just that they have become, in some cases, maybe a little bit more niche.
Yeah.
They certainly have become more specialized. They certainly are not the one size fits all medium that they used to be.
Yeah.
When you think about what radio used to do, it used to be a, a, for one thing, an all family entertainer.
Mhm.
And one of its big pitches was that once you had made the rather substantial investment in the hardware, and once you were able to actually get a signal out of the thing, it was pretty much free entertainment. Just
Mhm.
like television was originally. You get the set, you put up the rabbit ears, and then you have endless entertainment, or at least three channels worth, or three and a half channels worth, and that helped certainly to sell the medium. And I think that successive media, including things like videotape recorders and so on, have had, and MP3 players
Mhm.
have had kind of the same allure, that once you buy this, you've got this potentially endless source of entertainment for not much more investment. And of course, the even more important, we've been able to really customize it to the individual's tastes as time has gone on.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how LGBTQ folks have been represented in radio to that?
It's an interesting thing. We tend to think of progress as being linear and as always being improvement. And in reality, the story of the representation of LGBTQ people in media, period, and especially in radio, is not at all linear, nor not at all a positive progression. There is and this is not just something that people imagine. I mean, there really
Mhm.
were queer characters, identifiably queer characters, in radio in its fairly early days. If we go back to the days when radio did things like dramas and comedy and variety programs,
Mhm.
for instance, there was a series called Mert and Marge, which also had a couple films connected to it. It was about basically what was something kind of unusual: two working women working in the entertainment industry, in this case, the theater industry. And one of the supporting characters was named Clarence Tiffingtuffer, which you can conjure with that a while.
Yeah.
Um, but it was played by Ray Hodge, and he was identifiably, I guess, a gay man simply because of his gender performance, which was
Right.
rather effeminate. And and also a little bit about the things that interested him. He was very interested. He was the kind of the wardrobe and props person for this
Mm.
theater troupe. And they were always accusing him of or telling him, warding him off, trying to wear some of the women's costumes and that type of thing. But you had him, and then in terms of women, you had Tallulah Bankhead, who was
Mhm.
a kind of today we would refer to her as a multi-platform personality.
Mhm.
She was certainly on radio. She was on film. She made personal appearances. And for one thing, she had this wonderful, wonderful voice, which was probably conditioned by way too much bourbon or something. But it was sort of husky and therefore sort of masculine, but it was also rather theatrical, and and it wasn't just the way she sounded, but the things she said. And she was the daughter of a very influential and important Southern family, and so maybe because of that, of course, that can kind of cut both ways. That can either make somebody very guarded about their reputation, about the family reputation, or it can be very freeing. And in Tallulah's case, it certainly was very freeing. And one of the things that she was very free about discussing were her, were her romances, how she spent her time. She, for a woman in the 30s and 40s, she certainly led a very free lifestyle. And there were stories about her and her romances with women and with men, but largely with women. And it became actually the stuff of jokes on radio. She would appear on variety shows, with the likes of Bob Hope and so on, and they would refer to her with masculine pronouns, for instance. And that, of course, was meant as kind of a joke,
right?
Which is in sharp contrast to the reason that we do that today. But it was meant as kind of a dig or an insinuation about both her gender performance and her sexuality. And I don't think that it certainly, we went a number of years before we had anything like that on radio again. A lot of this owes, I would argue, to the immediate post-war period and McCarthyism and that sort of thing, where to be different in any way was not a good thing. And certainly to be perceived as gay was, in many respects, just as bad as being perceived or being connected with socialism or communism. And because of your sexuality, you were subject to, and the way society looked at it, you were subject to blackmail. And if you were subject to blackmail, then your loyalties could always be tested. And even though there was very little evidence that came out of the McCarthy hearings in the Senate or the HUAC hearings in the House during the 1950s that demonstrated that lesbian or gay people were any more likely to be turned by Russia or any foreign power. This was something that I think, because it was, again, a symbol of difference, was something that people were willing to believe. And radio at that time, of course, was almost exclusively commercially supported. And most programs were owned by the sponsors. And the sponsors, of course, being in business to sell consumer products and therefore to try to maintain some sort of popular image among the audience, didn't like to do risky things. And so somebody like a Tallulah Bankhead, was not going to work during that time. And certainly somebody like a Clarence Tiffingtuffer was not going to work during that time. And so this was actually an extremely straight time in radio. And really, that persists well into the 1970s. And it's really only when we get into the 1980s that via some fairly popular and some fairly daring and certainly envelope pushing acts, musical acts, popular music acts, that we start getting anything that appears queer on the radio at all. Part of her act was that she was always trying to live up to her name. By the way, if I can add just a little. Oh yeah,
go ahead, please.
People talk about the queerness of Batman and Robin. And if you look at the very campy 1960s television series rendition of the Batman and Robin story, and there are so many queer things about that. And of course, we know that camp is a form that is associated with LGBTQ people. But if over time, there were a number of guest stars on that show who were queer. I mean, they were closeted for the most part, but Cesar Romero as the Joker. Of course, he had was famous for kind of playing the Latin lover and that type of thing, but he was queer. Tallulah Bankhead actually, played one of the supervillains on that show. It was toward the end of her career, and sadly, her career and her health were collapsing during that time. But like a lot of people, she was turning to television. She had a very memorable appearance on the Lucy and Desi Comedy Hour in 1960, and then she also was in the Batman series, and I think she was Black Widow was the name of her character.
Oh, I love that.
But she was completely in terms of course, this is a show that's supposed to be all family. I mean, it airs early in the evening, but there was and so certainly her script, her lines were very sanitized, but there was still the unmistakable Tallulah delivery that was there. And if you wanted to do a queer reading of Black Widow, you certainly could.
I'm fascinated by these voices in history that have had such an impact on our society in ways that we couldn't have even grasped at that time. And now we're starting to see them kind of poke their way through in different ways. I mean, you've got whatever you feel about the film Green Book, that comes out, and you've got a documentary on Rock Hudson that just came out talking about his life and his existence. And some people, I'm seeing more and more folks talk about like Hedy Lamarr and her stuff with Wi-Fi and the things that she kind of didn't get attention for and maybe should have gotten a little attention for. And it's fascinating to me how these people, and I'm sure it's happened throughout history, but it's how these people's heads start to poke out of the sand a little bit of, look, this is someone who was doing this before everyone else, and we should be paying attention to that. So talking about Tallulah Bankhead to me is interesting, because that's one that should be in that lineup of folks.
You're really right. There are, in fact, the New York Times, as a kind of a recurring feature in their obituary section, has started kind of quite literally disinterring some of these people.
Oh my gosh, yes. I was interviewed by the woman who does this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Sure. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So for those who are not familiar with it, they go back and they look at people who either weren't recognized at all during their lives and whose obits never ran in any major publication, or who had this kind of secret side to their life that didn't get widely reported. And I think Hedy Lamarr is certainly an outstanding example of that. This is a woman who, by all accounts, was brilliant. And yet we know her primarily for her film roles, where, frankly, she wasn't so much. And, I would go back and in terms of actors alone, if you look at people or people who were celebrities, people like Barbara Stanwyck, I think, are a very good example. This is a woman who was, I don't know if people realized at the time how groundbreaking she was. There was this Western on ABC in the 1960s called The Big Valley, which was in sharp contrast to every other Western that was dominated by women. You had Linda Evans and Barbara Stanwyck was the matriarch of this family, and she was she may have had some other strong male characters on there, but she was the boss, and she was the moral center of that family. And if she didn't want something to happen, it did not happen. And Barbara Stanwyck was, from what we understand, off camera every bit as big a presence. And I'm thinking about Johnny Mathis, for example. Now, here was somebody who was, kind of a crooner and that type of thing, but somebody who really had to his managers or him, they had to really massage his image to make him acceptable to an audience. So, if you look at his album covers and you look at publicity photos, and if you look at how he appeared on stage when he performed, he was always very preppy. And he, as it happened, as an African-American man, he also happened to be kind of light-skinned. But the idea was to make him as non-threatening to white audiences, particularly to white parent audiences, as possible. And if you look at people like Little Richard, He, of course, he had his own queerness about him, which he, had a complicated relationship with. But, one of the reasons that his persona was the way it was it made him less threatening. He was not seen as this, threat to straight white women, young women, because he was, he would do these outrageous things, and he, had an elaborate hairstyle and the little mustache and the makeup and the whole bit.
Jumping ahead just a little bit, just
Sure.
contemporary times. Why do you think podcasting, and this is so meta, I wrote that in my notes too, but why do you think podcasting is such an attractive medium for queer audiences or LGBTQ folks?
I think it's an attractive medium really for audiences broadly, and I'll address that first and then talk specifically about LGBTQ audiences. I think one of the reasons that it is as attractive as it is a fairly easy medium to be a creator in.
Mm-hmm.
And just as, desktop editing software has made everybody, a filmmaker and television producer, and just as, software enabled people to edit music to video, and so to create their own works that way. I think that with just a few $100s, you can get a very credible setup for podcasting. And the big thing, of course, is promoting it and getting it distributed and that sort of thing. And that's where maybe some, there's a little bit of differentiation in terms of the investment. But you can do a podcast fairly inexpensively. Also, it's very individualized.
Mm-hmm.
And so people can, in much the same way that the people who were experimenting with Super 8 cameras at the end of World War II and formed the basis of kind of the independent film movements in, starting in the late 1940s, because these were affordable, because they could capture and tell stories that they wanted to see captured and told. I think that promotes their popularity. Now, for LGBTQ audiences, I think that's really exaggerated, because queer audiences have always suffered from the fact that they have been shut out of mainstream media. So, starting with the motion picture code in the 1930s, that for 35 years pretty much meant that if you had a queer presence on screen, it had to be so heavily coded that the average viewer couldn't pick it out. And you really had to be attuned to it. And that oftentimes meant you had to be LGBTQ yourself, and you had to be looking for it. And you probably were going to be looking for it because you were just simply so starved. And I think the same is true of other media as well. People would do, this is, the source of queer readings in media, is that, people just wanted to see that. And I think when it came to podcasting, particularly since anything queer was, had disappeared from audio media starting in the 1950s, I think there is, there has been a real appetite for something that speaks to queer people. And the fact that you can do that fairly readily, you don't have to be hired by a large media organization like iHeartMedia or Entercom or something like that. That this is something you can do yourself, and you can be responsible for yourself, and you set the rules, they aren't set for you, is a very, very important thing. Audio media are important because they're very portable, they're very individualized. Who hasn't had the experience? Well, okay. Who growing up during a particular period in time hasn't had the experience of having a little transistor radio with the little earphone, and being, alone in your room at night, and some, people talk about, pulling the covers up over their head and listening to things that they found spoke to them, but that they knew their parents would disapprove of. And boy, if you're a young lesbian, or if you're a young gay guy, or you're questioning your sexuality, and you're not hearing this over the air, then how nice to be able to listen to people talk about it. Because, as I said at the outset, radio has such an important role in forming our tastes and helping us make the transition from adolescence or from teens into adulthood. And if you think about it, there's a whole generation of young men, particularly, who learned about how to be a young man by listening to disc jockeys on the radio. And even women, I think, learned about their roles from listening to the patter and listening to female singers and that sort of thing. But inevitably it was straight. And if you weren't straight, or if you were questioning your straightness, you have to do a real interesting reading of those things that you're listening to in order for it to be at all valuable for you. So, podcasts are great because you can have queer people talking about queer history, talking about the coming out process, talking about how you deal with families, how you deal with the workplace, how you deal with your friends, and it speaks to you as a listener.
Have you ever seen the show Ghosts? There's one on the BBC and then there's one on CBS. So so it's based off a BBC show, but the premise.
Wait a minute. Yes, I have. This is the one where the people who have died at this hotel.
All throughout history. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The American version, they're making one of the storylines is they're making a podcast based off of one of the ghosts' murder. And the ghosts throughout history keep saying, "What's a podcast? What's a podcast?" And the older ghosts say, "It's just the radio." It's just radio. And that's like a running gag of like, what's it's radio, just accept it as radio. That's what I was thinking about, is you were giving this wonderful thing about history. I was like, oh yeah, like ghosts. So I really want to, I like the transition that's happening here, because a lot of your career has been to talk about queer identity, LGBTQ radio, all of that. I often get the question, why does studying all of this stuff matter? Like, why do we care about how pop culture affects the society? And I'm very interested in your reaction to that, because I think you've already outlined it through what you've already said, that these things have impacts on people, but I'm curious how you answer that question.
I think the best way of talking about that is to use the metaphor or the allegory of the iceberg, where pop culture is for most people the part of the iceberg that they see, the part that is above the ocean surface. But there is much more to it that is below the surface. And that which is below is oftentimes first the most interesting, and I would argue also the part that has the most potential to have an impact on society. It's no accident that when African American characters first began to kind of populate TV screens, and especially characters who were, I'm going to use the word authentic, or real, or at least connected to the biographies of the people of African American creators, that they were on comedies. Situation comedies largely, or in comedy variety, or I'm thinking there Flip Wilson or musical variety programs, because those are the ones that get under people's radar. If you have kind of a hard-hitting drama that has a message that people might perceive as beating them over the head, as being very pedantic, I think there is a defense mechanism that people put up, and part of that defense mechanism is the embodiment is the handheld remote. They just simply change channels, or cut off that stream. I think the comedy, the value of comedies and lighter forms of entertainment is that they can convey messages in a much more surreptitious way. Susan Sontag, talking about camp, said that camp neutralizes moral indignation. And I think in the same way, anything that is comedic in nature or light entertainment in nature can neutralize moral indignation simply by entertaining us and planting its seeds, laying its eggs where we don't see them, and these ideas just grow in us, or the change is very slow in taking place in our the way we think about things, the priorities we put on things, and so on. And the same, by the way, is true of science fiction, since we've already kind of talked about that. I think one of the wonderful things about science fiction is that you can communicate ideas about the way you would like the world to be, and you can get away with it in science fiction because it's not real, because this is something that's taking place, in a different time. It's taking place in the future, or it's taking place on a different planet, or something like that. And yet it's a real reflection of the way the author would like to see the world be, or what the idealized version of that might be.
Yeah. It's funny, as you were saying that, I was thinking of, I'm not a huge Star Trek person. My husband is a massive Star Trek person, but I do like the movie. I forget which one it is, but it's the one where they come to Earth and there's the whales that they need to, and they go to the hospital and a woman is suffering, and the guy, the doctor, the science Star Trek doctor, hands her a pill and says, "Here, take this," and it instantly cures her problem immediately. And he just says, "Oh, modern medicine is so barbaric." And it's such a good example of, we could fix these problems. Yes, a pill to fix all of your medical issues is stretching it, but we could do that. And here's a movie that's saying, look, why are we not thinking about a better way to handle medical situations that we've just taken for granted as they're going to be an issue? There's nothing to do about it. Like, I think one grew back someone's ear immediately. Like, it was just a whole thing of, he just handed them something and immediately they were fixed. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that pop culture has that ability to plant that in someone's brain of, why aren't we doing this in another way? Why is this not something we're challenging?
Well, and not just things that are of a kind of a medical nature or a very personal nature that way, but things that have social and cultural implications. And since you used the example of Star Trek, for The Voyage Home, by the way.
Thank you. The Voyage Home.
You can go back to the original series, and at a time when it was impossible for characters of different races to interact intimately on camera, because the sponsor, the networks always said, well, the sponsors won't have it. One of the big complaints about Star Trek over the years, including from me on the printed page in a few cases, was, okay, so for all of its progressivism, for all of its utopianism with regard to race and gender and that type of thing, it still, it really never had LGBTQ characters. It never depicted honestly an LGBTQ character. You always had to read in to the storyline, and this persisted well into the 1990s. And so you have Star Trek Discovery, one of the more recent series, and I swear to you, most of the characters on that, including, in my view, all of the interesting characters, are either non-binary or gay or lesbian. They made what I think was an incredibly intelligent decision in casting the comedian Tig Notaro.
Oh yeah, she's great.
Yeah, and she just has for one thing, they give her the best lines.
Yeah.
And she just eats up the screen. One of the reasons that popular culture, I think, is a fit subject for study, and this kind of gets to the latter part of our conversation here, is that it does make a difference. We tend to think of it as being kind of a light, fluffy, inconsequential topic, and it's not at all. It's really the only thing in a lot of cases that has ever really changed the way people live. You do it first through popular media and the things that people enjoy doing. Yes, you can legislate. Yes, you can command things to happen and that type of thing. But the real change occurs when people want it to, and they will want it to when it's something that means something to them. And it's those cultural artifacts and cultural practices that are the things that are most meaningful to people.
Thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Most Popular on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Please take the time to follow, rate, and review, and more information, including additional resources for educators, can be found on my website, adriantrier-bieniek.com. The website is linked in episode notes, and I am on Instagram at Dr. Adrian. Thanks to my students for the encouragement to keep making these episodes, and I will see you next time.